null binding with the Coppergate stitch, also known as the York stitch or the Jorvik stitch. We're going to start working in the round, as one would when making a sock, hat, or a mitten. For materials, you will need a null binding needle and some yarn. I'm using a handmade wooden needle that is roughly 4 inches long, and for yarn I'm using some black worsted weight yarn that I just had lying around. Ideally, someone who is just starting to learn null binding would use a worsted or chunky weight wool yarn that was unplied, since that will make joining new lengths of wool easier to do. Unlike knitting, null binding is worked with short lengths of yarn, so to start we want a length of yarn that is roughly a yard long. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is thread our needle, and you will thread your needle just like you would a regular sewing needle. Once through, this end is the tail, the long end is our working end. And you want to make the tail about 2/3 the length of the working end. Then we're going to take the working end of the yarn, not the tail, and tie a simple slip knot. So have the shortest end be in your left hand, and on the right hand the yarn continues through up to the needle. So you want to hold your hands so that there's roughly 6 inches of yarn in between them, and make a loop with the right crossing. Slip it over your fingers and tighten your loop. Make sure that the loop collapses when you pull the short end and not the long end. Now that we've made our slip knot, we're going to start casting on our first row of stitches. So to start, we're going to make sure that the short end is on the left on the bottom and the working end is on the left on the top. So to start, bring your needle from front to back through the slip loop and then up in front of the working end. Pull it smaller so it's a little bit more snug. We want these loops to be roughly the size of our needle. Any bigger and they're going to look a bit sloppy. We're going to bring the needle front to back through the loop, the slip loop, and then back to front through the previous loop we just made. Pull that. Now that we've got 2 loops, we're going to continue adding on stitches until we've got 12. Front to back, back to front, pull through. Sometimes if you're working with quite a long end, it'll get tangled up and you'll have to gently work the knot out and then continue through. 3 loops, front to back, back to front, pull through, 4 loops. As you go along, you want to make sure you're catching only the slip loop and the previous stitch. Front to back, back to front, pull through, 5. Front to back, back to front, pull through, 6. And we're casting on 12 stitches because that seems to be the optimum number to end up with a flat disc once we pull our slip loop tight. 7. 8. 9. 10. And here you can see that the tail of the yarn I'm working with is just about the same length as the working end. So I'm going to go to my needle and just slide it along. So now I've got a longer length of yarn where there isn't a tail. 11, 12. Okay, now that we have 12 loops, we're going to close this round of stitches and start prepping for our next row. To start the next row of stitches and to close this loop, pass the working end of your yarn front to back through the first loop you made, and then back to front through the last loop you made, taking care not to split the yarn. Pull through. You can see you've formed a bit of a loop. Keep this loose. We're going to use it again in just a second. Repeat what you just did, front to back through the first loop, back to front through the last loop. Pull your needle through. Now, you're going to take the first loop you made and pinch it between your thumb and your forefinger of your left hand. Then you're going to take the second loop and make thumb facing towards you. Now, take the tail end of the yarn, the short tail, and pull it tight. This will collapse our little bundle of stitches inwards. If there's a bit of a gap or a hole in the middle, don't worry. This will disappear with practice. Okay, so to start the next row, look to the stitches just to the right of your thumb. There should be several little loops. If you pull a little bit forward, you should see the later loops separate from the closest loop to your thumb. What you want to do is pass your needle front to back through that first loop. Take care not to catch the tail of the yarn, visible in the back there. Front to back through the loop to the right of your thumb, and then back to front through both the loops on your thumb and underneath the tail. Pull that snug. Make sure your tail is out of the way. To finish this stitch, we're going to slip the first loop off to the back of the thumb. Pull the second loop to snug down the first loop. Shift so that that's the loop you're pinching between your thumb and your forefinger. Snug it down, and then tighten this end to snug this loop. Now, because we want to create a disc, we're going to increase every other stitch to make it flat. To increase a stitch, we're not going to pick up the next loop. Instead, we're going to come directly around to the back and back to the front through the first two loops over the thumb and underneath the working tail. Pull tight. Loop to snug it down. Pull our working end to snug the second loop. For the next stitch, we're going to pick up the next loop, front to back, back to front, over the thumb, going underneath our tail. Slip the first loop over the thumb, pull the second to tighten it, pull the tail to tighten the second loop. Increase another stitch, back to front, over the thumb loop, through the thumb loops, underneath the tail. Pull it snug, slip the first loop over, pull the second loop to snug it down, pull the working tail to snug the second loop. Pull tight, slip off the first loop, snug it down, snug down the second loop. If you continue working in this fashion, increasing every other stitch, you will create a flat disc. To curl up your edges and form a sort of a cylindrical tube with one flat end, what you're going to do is stop increasing every other stitch. So what you'll do is you'll make your stitch, slide off your loops, snug everything down, and then instead of increasing, continue directly to the next loop and continue to form the stitches as you have. To decrease stitches, simply pick up 2 loops to the right of your thumb. So here you can see these gaps are the separate loops. So instead of picking up the closest one and then the second one, you're going to pick up the second loop and then the first, front to back. This way it goes straight through both loops and neither are twisted. Front to back through 2 loops, back to front through the thumb, and then snug down as usual. This is actually a pretty sharp decrease in stitches. If you want a more subtle decrease in stitches, you can decrease every other stitch. However, when you are decreasing, make sure you pick up 2 stitches, starting with the one closest to your body and not the stitch closest to your thumb. Front to back, back to front, and snug tight. And there you have it, the basics of Nalbinding with the Coppergate stitch. This tutorial deals with the Coppergate stitch in the round rather than on the flat or in a straight line or chain, because Coppergate stitch tends to twist fairly severely and it's easier to work in the round than in a chain. Happy Nalbinding!